Our insurance premiums are going to get hiked thanks to today's episode, Dodge 'em. Atari has once again returned to the pool of arcade conversions for its second of three fall 1980 releases, Dodge 'em. Fortunately, like Circus Atari or Space Invaders, it's an excellent home version of a fairly popular game from the 1970s, Head-On, meaning that just like those two, it's a classic home version of a classic game, albeit not an official one. Yes, like Circus Atari before it, Dodge 'em, or Dodger Cars under the Sears branding, is another unlicensed clone of someone else's game. In this case, the original Head-On was developed and published by Sega Gremlin. Sega's corporate history is a nightmare of mergers, acquisitions, and spin-offs, but according to Ken Horowitz's Sega Arcade Revolution book, Sega was struggling to get solid footing in the US market in the mid to late 70s. On the flip side, Gremlin had been making games since about 1972, and moved into the video game market in 1976 with the hit game Blockade. But two brutal winters in 1977 and 1978 hurt their supply chain. It needed an influx of money to survive. The two companies began talks, and on September 29, 1978, Sega purchased Gremlin, expanding both entities' manufacturing and distribution range. Sega got Gremlin's Western distribution and manufacturing, while Gremlin got access to Sega's foreign capabilities and financing. This also gave the new Sega Gremlin a foot in the door for licensing and distributing Japanese arcade games in the West. This proved fortuitous when one of their earliest post-merger games, Head-On, was published around April 1979 and ended up being a huge success. Head-On was conceived by Gremlin designer Lane Hoke, and developed by Bill Blewett shortly before the Sega merger, and put the player in a space consisting of multiple circular lanes filled with dots. The player is tasked with collecting all the dots by driving over them with their car without being rammed by other cars. Hoke's original design billed this as a two-player game, but he realized that since players would spend their time trying to ram each other, having the opposing car be computer-controlled would really push people to try and extend their games as long as possible. Both the player and computer cars can only change lanes at the gaps in the middle of the X and Y axes, though the player can also change speed as one way to help avoid colliding with the computer, which will always try to be in the same lane as you. Head-On followed on from the concept of rounds popularized in Space Invaders the year before to feature what was billed as the multi-phase game. What this meant was that each round would be more difficult than the previous one, typically with the addition of up to 3 computer-controlled cars to avoid. In a 2017 interview with Blewett by historian Ethan Johnson, the developer explains that he ensured each of the computer cars had their own personalities and added other little touches, such as speeding up the cars when a crash was inevitable and ensuring the cars would slip into a lane if they were about to hit a wall while shifting. An anonymous Japanese Sega engineer suggested that Blewett remove the timer that he originally planned for the game, which proved to be a smart decision as well. The game already flies by at a rapid pace and simply doesn't need the additional wrinkle. With players maneuvering throughout a single-screen maze to collect dots and avoid enemies, Head-On does feature some of the key concepts behind 1980's Pac-Man. It's possible that this isn't a coincidence. Prior to the Sega merger, Gremlin founder Frank Fogelman had Namco's founder Masaya Nakamura come through to see if Namco would be interested. And after giving Nakamura the key to the main office, Fogelman said that his guest ended up spending most of the night playing Head-On. About 16 months later, Namco would publish Pac-Man, another dot and maze game, and while there's been no confirmation from the Namco side of things, Head-On's success and Nakamura's obsession suggested it was at least an influence. What makes Sega Gremlin's game particularly devilish if you're coming to it from Pac-Man is that crashing will cause all the dots to reappear on screen, making it rather tricky to actually finish a stage. Nevertheless, Head-On was a big success for the company. It was reported as one of the top 10 most successful games of 1979, and led the company to produce a sequel later that year called Head-On 2 that added a 4th computer car and turnaround lanes. Head-On and its sequel would be cloned both officially and unofficially by their competitors as well, with Exidy's Crash, Ichibutsu's Rolling Crash, and Konami's Car Chase copying the first game, and Nintendo cloning the second with Head-On N. With this popular pedigree and a lack of official home conversions, it's unsurprising that a number of unlicensed clones appeared on home computers in the early 80s. And on the console side, Atari's developers would be interested in producing a home version for the VCS. Dodge 'em would be the first project undertaken by Atari developer Carlo Meninsky. who was hired on in 1979 with the intention of working on computer animation, but instead found herself doing Atari VCS games after the Activision quartet left the company that summer. In an interview with Will Nichols, Meninsky said that she was given a list of game concepts to pick from that included a version of Head-On described as a car crash maze game, which she thought sounded interesting. Prior to coming to Atari, she said her game experience was largely limited to seeing Pong around and being a big fan of the adventure text-based computer game. Nevertheless, Meninsky picked up on game design quickly, producing one of 1980's standout titles on her first try. Much like Head-On, Dodgem has the multiple lanes, the gaps to shift between them, the dots that will reappear after a collision, an accelerator button, and computer cars that increase in aggression and numbers, up to 2 in this version, as you work through the game's levels. It's a remarkably faithful take on the game that effectively captures the speed, intensity, and quick decision-making needed to succeed. After 3 turns, the game ends, though if you clear 5 rounds without a collision, the game will subtract one of your remaining turns, meaning Dodgem maxes out at 15 rounds, unlike the arcade game. Meninsky did add a couple twists on the formula to keep this home rendition interesting. The right difficulty switch can be flipped to determine if the computer cars always start in the same positions, or if they'll shift between starting points throughout the maze, which essentially forces players to not get used to specific patterns to win each round. And 2 distinct 2-player modes are included on this cartridge. The first is your standard version where players alternate turns after each crash, much as you'd see in games like Space Invaders. The other 2-player mode is like something out of Nintendo's Pac-Man Vs. game from 2 decades on, where one player controls the standard point-collecting vehicle as usual, but the second player starts out controlling the crash car. If the vehicles collide, the 2 players switch roles, giving the other player the opportunity to collect points themselves. While it's not as intense as Pac-Man Vs., given that there's only one opponent and you can both see the entire screen at once, this is a clever and innovative twist on Head-On and Huck's original vision of the game. As an amusing little footnote, Meninsky said that fellow VCS developer Jim Huether was the model for the man driving the car on the game's box art. The game's review and the pages of Video Magazine are largely effusive. Noting that the arcade original Head-On continues to be popular, Bill Kunkel and Arnie Katz write, accurately I should add, that the game cannot be solved with reflexes alone, but rather requires planning a route in advance and executing it properly. Once the second car shows up, they indicate that planning pretty much has to go out the window, providing the game its true appeal. The 2 of them weren't wrong. Early on, Dodgem is indeed fairly rote, but it becomes so much more intense in experience as you move up the stages. Surprisingly for such a widely cloned game in the arcade and home computer space, the only other takes on Head-On besides Dodgem to appear on a home console were on the Bally Professional Arcade as basic programs. The first was Collision Course, written by Mike Peace and sold under his Wavemakers label originally as a standard basic tape, and later as a remastered version using Blue RAM Extended Basic and the Blue RAM Memory Expansion. While this is in many ways the same as Head-On, Peace did include a few of his own ideas, though they don't necessarily make a better game. Most obvious is that you need to manage how long you're pushing into a direction to move, as it's very easy to overshoot into the lane beyond the one you're trying to get into, and pushing these directions into a wall will cause you to crash. Additionally, Peace brings back the timer mechanic Blue had abandoned after a fashion as a fuel gauge, displayed in the original release as a background color shift over time, and in the Blue RAM take as a simple fuel bar. The more you drive at high speed, the faster you run out of gas, forcing you to manage your speed a little more closely than other takes. Finally, Peace adds in bonus flags that can be grabbed on the course for bonus points. The Blue RAM version is significantly nicer graphics and little animations, such as the tow truck that takes your car away after a crash, but these both play pretty well and feature fantastic usage of the system's audio capabilities. The other Bally version is Smash Up, which appeared on Mike White's 1983 epic Quadra. Quadra is best described as 4 distinct games in one, along the lines of arcade games like Tron or Gorf, with one of those being Smash Up. Alongside clones of Head-On, Space Invaders, and Avalanche, Quadra also includes the original game Safecracker, where players must maneuver through multiple levels of a guarded maze to reach and defuse a bomb. Mike White said that Smash Up was done independently before the other Quadra games, and brought into that program for its proper release. While it started out as a regular basic release, due to Quadra's size and complexity, is significantly better known for its Blue RAM rendition, which has fewer load screens to contend with. All that said, Smash Up is basically just Head-On, with the opposing car getting faster as the game goes on. White did note that even Mike Peace was interested in how he managed the tire squealing sound effect here, which does sound pretty good. Sometime after finishing her second game, Warlords, Mininski briefly left Atari before being roped back in with a request to modify Dodgem as a marketing tool for Mercedes garbage trucks. As it turned out, developer Mike Albaugh was unable to figure out how she'd managed to squeeze her code into the game. Graphics artist Mimi Doggett did the truck graphics for the cars, and Mininski did the hack in her spare time while working elsewhere, ultimately getting talked back into working at Atari again after only a few months away. This particular rendition of Dodgem has never turned up, so it's unclear what Atari's management ever did with the program. Despite being a great game, Dodgem didn't appear to crack Atari's upper echelon of sales, not appearing at all on what limited sales charts we have from the early 80s. In the latter half of the 80s, the game only sold 2,572 copies. Pretty paltry numbers even in the VCS's twilight years. Yet given how common the game is on the aftermarket, it's possible that sales of Dodgem were front-loaded, and it lost steam once Pac-Man hit the platform. Sadly, without more information, we can't say for certain. And Head-On's story isn't quite over yet either, though. Around 1990, new regulations from the Japanese Ministry of Industry required all new arcade cabinets being produced and sold in Japan to include a game of some sort. At this point, arcade machines largely included a baseline JAMMA board. JAMMA being the de facto standard connection that other arcade boards would plug into, allowing operators to easily swap machines on the floor without buying a whole new cabinet or dealing with more work-intensive conversion kits. To meet this requirement, game companies that sold arcade cabinets, including Sega and their ubiquitous Astro City and Blast City machines, started bundling in very basic, simple games to meet the law's technical requirements, but were not really suitable for commercial play. In Sega's case, it was a stripped-down version of Head-On called Dotori-kun. It lacks scoring and is visually a big step down from the real game, but it allowed Sega to keep on selling cabinets. Programmer Chris Covell even revisited this little game to create Dotoriman Jr., which is essentially Pac-Man using the same basic rule set as the original Head-On, in a way, bringing the saga of these two games full circle. Back on the VCS, Dodgem may sit in the shadow of better-known maze games like the Pac-Man Trilogy or Mousetrap, but this pioneer of the genre that would come to play a big role in arcades and at home is no worse for it. While the early going may become rote without flipping the difficulty switch to allow for random spawn points, Dodgem remains one of the true classics on the console. I've called out a few games in 1980 as being among the best games of the year, and in fairness, this is the year that the VCS really found its footing both commercially and creatively. And with that in mind, Dodgem is a welcome part of that upper echelon of software and one that holds up even today. Next time, we're in a maze of another kind.